Female post-secondary students must deal with bias and barriers before they even step on campus due to sexism among faculties or academics. Once on campus, they might find a lack of availability of healthcare or hygiene products in on-campus facilities and residences. Their health can also be affected in more traumatic manners as they can be targeted for sexual assault. When they enter the workforce, women will have to struggle with visibility versus tokenism, wage disparity, and the grossly unequal ratio of men to women, C-suite positions. Women and girls are highly underrepresented in STEM fields. They face increased amounts of sexism in these fields, even if sexist behavior or speech is benevolent or well-meaning. When they excel, they may be seen as a mandatory hire, visibility promotion, or attain their position through sexually based means. A rising tide lifts all the boats, but women need to make waves just to stay afloat. Throughout the night, we encourage everyone in the room to discuss how we can all work together over the next 10 months to promote gender empowerment in a meaningful way on this campus and within the broader Regina community. On behalf of my wonderful URSU team, welcome to the Gender Empowerment Summit 2020. Thank you.
I was elected November 9th, sworn in November 23rd of 2020. And what I was just referencing in terms of media outreach and whatnot about what's it like to be the first woman mayor? And I mean, to be honest, it irritates me. It's a question that irritates me because I don't know what it's like to be a male mayor. I just know what it's like to be a woman. And then the flip side of it would be that women are not homogenous. We're not all the same. We have different interests, we have different beliefs, we have different wants and needs and desires. And so to say that one woman could possibly represent all women, it is something that frankly I refuse to take on. My favorite conversation was, one of my individuals that was a fellow board member, a 63-year-old gentleman, the definition of old boys club. He was a lovely human being. It's not his fault that he's in the old boys club. It was simply the privilege he was born into, and he worked hard all his life, and there he is. And we had to sit down, and he said, we were sitting down, and he had heard a rumor. And so I finally just said, so do you hear any rumors? And he goes, okay, thank goodness, you're gonna tell me that you're gonna run for mayor. And I said, well, I'm thinking about it. And he said, you have to do it. I said, no, I don't have to do anything. And then he said, no, he said, I think the time is right. I think the community is ready to elect a woman. He said, I wouldn't have said it 4 years ago, I wouldn't have said it 10 years ago. He said, but I think right now, at this moment in time, you can get elected, and in part because you're a woman. And I sort of sat there and I stared at him. I didn't say anything, I didn't react. And he says, did I offend you? And I said, no, I'm simply absorbing the fact that in my lifetime, I would never have thought that being a woman would be an advantage to get elected. I said, and I think it's fascinating that you're being 63 years old and a dude, you think that right now. And so it's really in my lifetime being able to witness, I think a little bit of what you were referencing was being excluded or assumed that you're the secretary in the room, or that you can't possibly be smart and hardworking and competent, to a point where it was people who knew me and knew that I was smart and I was competent and I was hardworking, that those are the qualities you need in order to enter into, you don't even need them sometimes, trust me, but that it would serve me well and it would serve the city well.
There's a really long road to go in terms of being truly representative of the community that we serve. And I think Mayor Massey spoke eloquently about why it's important to have that representation, and why all the examples of when there are a diversity of views at the decision-making tables, better decisions get made. We also have the highest rates of intimate partner violence in Saskatchewan amongst all provinces in Canada. It's actually twice the national average. We have to constantly push and call on government to do more to support survivors, to provide for funding for second stage shelters, which is something that this province doesn't do, even though almost every other province in Canada does. Second highest rates of sexual assault amongst all provinces in Canada. We still don't have a provincial sexual assault strategy, even though many other provinces in Saskatchewan or in Canada does. We have a real disparity in access to reproductive health services in Saskatchewan. And that's a problem that I think is getting worse as time goes on, not better. And who's at the decision-making table directly affects that. Another one, we have one of the highest gender wage gaps in the country, and we're one of the few provinces that doesn't have pay equity legislation.
So intersectionality framework for me becomes a way in which it opens up the critique of liberalism, the critique of individuality. For example, it's hard for me to understand the concept of gender of women's experiences based on gender alone, right? Gender is not a monolithic identity. When we think of gender, we think about all its intersectional connections. I mean, thinking about the women of color, trans women of color. When we think about sexuality, we think about the diverse ways in which sexuality interacts with race as well. And we see the whole history of, even in our very own movement, anti-racist and feminist movement, the intersectional framework has not been fully recognized. And that's the reason why queers, women of color, queers of color, women of color, trans of color, and including Black women are displaced in feminist movements as well as in anti-racist movements in the past. So I would like to end by thinking about, again, going back to the whole intersectionality framework, that gender is not a monolithic concept. Gender is connected to race, class, sexuality, and more so of migration. Our beloved mayor talks about migration, migrants, and how do we reimagine our practices that also continue to create spaces of conversation, of gender, of sexuality within migrant communities. What are some of the programs that we can perhaps develop and engage and create that could, beyond multiculturalism, but also to think about spaces in which, conversations of gender and sexuality among racialized communities, among migrant communities could also be engaged, so that we will not only be acknowledging the Western notion of gender empowerment or of gender representation, but also a more contextual and more specific way of empowerment.
I remember my first few days on campus at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon. I would walk through the engineering building and look at the class photos hung along the hallway. These grad photos started around 1920s, and the first thing I noticed is how small the graduating classes were in the early photos. They were comprised of about 20 students and the deans at the time. As I continued down the hallway, it took approximately 30 paces before I saw what I didn't even realize I was looking for: the first female graduate. No woman had ever been a part of the graduating class until 1946, 34 years after the college was opened. Now, this trend is not isolated to the University of Saskatchewan, as I imagine most any institution where there is something akin to my engineering hallway, it would take students a significant number of paces before the first female popped up, and even more before women became a substantial presence in the photos. Thankfully, at the U of S, numbers of graduating females have gone from only about 1 or 2 girls in the late 40s to where around 20% of my graduating class were females. How do we empower women and those who identify across the gender spectrum to join the STEM field? And how do we support them to stay in that field? Now, this is not an inclusive list by any means, but I see 3 things that are very important to ensuring women feel empowered in STEM, and taking these 3 steps are ones that have positively affected my own career. The 3 steps are being able to define what success means to you, finding a mentor and becoming one to others, and challenging gender stereotypes.
We must stand up for women of color who have been victims of discrimination and racism and violent attacks, and for Muslim women who are facing a rise in Islamophobia. Every woman should have the right to feel safe in public without having to worry that they will attack just because of their religion. And we must call out and put an end to Islamophobia that's poisoning our country. We must stand up for trans and gender diverse women who are too often victims of transphobic attacks and violence. This must end. Trans women are women, period. Feminism that doesn't include trans women is not feminism. We must include all women, regardless of expression, and we must always make sure that we are creating welcoming and inclusive environments for trans women in our workplaces, in our communities, and in our unions. Trans women are always welcome here with us. Black women face a different kind of prejudice, and we must dismantle and disrupt this collectively. We must amplify the voices of Black women and stand up against racism at every opportunity. We stand for our sisters with disabilities, both mental and physical. We see you and we appreciate you. You will always have a place, and we will use our voices to ensure you have a space and are valued. We must stand up for our sisters who are sex workers, who face violence and sex trafficking and a justice system that fails to protect them. Sex work is work. These workers deserve safety and to be treated with the respect and human decency that we show all others. We must stand for our sisters who are fighting against the conservative politicians who are trying to dictate our healthcare by attempting to take away our reproductive rights. These past few months, it's been so difficult to be watching what's happening in the United States as all the states are passing legislation banning abortion, and the Supreme Court has torn down Roe versus Wade and 50 years of precedent. We must fight back against this.
The time is now, and we need to have the difficult discussions and make the changes that we need to be more inclusive for gender diversity and inclusion for all equity-seeking groups. People with disabilities, people of color, Indigenous people, and non-binary friends across the whole spectrum. I want you to think about who the powers are that make these decisions. What do they look like? And who do they represent? Governments, employers, unions, and organizations of all levels must and need to put in place better policies and training to ensure that our community is whole and everyone is treated with dignity and feels safe, respected, included, and accepted. Collective agreements must also have language to protect diverse groups and diminish barriers that are affected to each individual groups of people.
And I stand here representing the queer and trans community, and especially the gender diverse community, as a trans woman and as a non-binary person and as a disabled one. And I want to remind us all that it's not just women affected by this. The trans men, gender diverse people across the board are affected by the same forms of violence, such as Roe v. Wade, the downfall of Roe v. Wade, or the continued restrictions of what we're allowed to do with our bodies. And I want to draw attention to the fact that we've done a lot of talking tonight. But where's the policy? Where's the implementation to follow these conversations? I appreciate Mayor Sandra bringing up that in 10 years we've seen little change. That same 10 years that I've been out as a trans woman, 5 of which I spent not quite being legally allowed to be who I am. In 2017, we saw the fall of the full decriminalization of transition and gender diverse peoples across Canada federally. And think about that for a minute. 5 years ago, I was kind of illegal. How does that feel, right? 5 years, that's not much time. And when we really want to implement these changes, when we really want to make a world that does bring an end to gender-based violence, we need to keep that in mind. We often talk about these things in the form of the self, in the form of the individual. But where's the community care? I hear all the time, oh, self-care, self-care. What about community care? When I started using a cane initially, I had to turn down a number of gigs and a number of jobs because I wasn't able to physically do them. In my community, the community of radicalized anarchist trans women who've faced violence their entire lives, were the people to put their money forward, to come into my house, bring me food when I needed it, to support me. It wasn't just my own actions that bring me to where I am today, but instead the actions of an entire community. And I think it's, as we continue this conversation, I think it's important that we find ways to change the conversation from how can we support an individual to how can we support a community that can work to heal itself.